There was very little air, it was extremely humid, and Eric Larson writes that U-boats probably smelled like cholera wards most of the time, and what didn't smell like toilet refuse or cholera smelled like diesel oil. So any way you looked at it, these were pretty difficult places to be. It was probably a good thing for the crew that your average U-boat was gone from German ports maybe 5 days at a time, and then they'd go back. Later in the war, they could stay out longer than that, but especially at the beginning, your average cruise was about 5 days. Constant risk of being sunk by destroyers. They didn't have to worry about depth charges yet. That would come later, but they were still always worried about English patrol boats and destroyers. And it was very dangerous duty indeed. Of the 17,000 Germans who served on U-boats during World War I, 5,000 never came back. 5,000 died. Highest casualty rate of any service in the First World War were German U-boats. Your life expectancy on the Western Front as an infantryman was a bit better, 10% chance you'd die there, but much higher as a U-boat. Coincidentally, 5,000 Germans died. They sank 5,000 ships during World War I, one ship per death. So one problem with the U-boats was not only were they uncomfortable and dangerous, they also couldn't obey the cruiser rules very well. How could they take on a crew? How could they give a prize crew to a threatened merchant vessel? And they couldn't stay on the surface very long. Their incentive and what they would prefer to do is sink the ship as soon as they could. But there was another problem with the Germans obeying the cruiser rules, which is what Wilson wanted them to do. Because even though a German U-boat might sink a British merchant ship, why should we care about that? Chances were there were American seamen or passengers on that ship, and that would bring the Germans into conflict with Wilson, who always believed the cruiser rules should be fulfilled to the letter by the German Navy. But the other problem about observing the cruiser rules was the British Navy. Now, the Germans claimed no particular right to sink American ships, at least not at the beginning. But they did claim the right to stop, search, and if necessary, destroy British merchant ships. And that meant the British had every incentive to stop them from doing that. The British did everything possible to discourage U-boats from even trying to observe the cruiser rules. Contrary to the naval agreement of 1909, the British began to arm their merchant ships, which they weren't supposed to do. 15 U-boats were sunk by freighters that were actually armed without the Germans knowing it. They let the Germans get up kind of close and then they opened fire, pretending to be unarmed when they were actually armed. And it was also true that German ships would fly false flags. So they wouldn't fly the Union Jack often, they'd fly an American flag or a neutral flag to fool the U-boats. And that was also in violation of the London Naval Agreement of 1909. In a very infamous incident that most Americans knew about then, in 1916, U-27, a German U-boat, intercepted a British freighter. It's called the Nicotian. The Germans made the freighter stop, and according to the cruiser rules, they surfaced, they got out, they looked at the cargo. The cargo actually happened to contain some wheat from the United States, but also 15 American mules, which makes me feel unhappy about the mules, what was about to happen to them. But that was the cargo of the Nicotian. So it's a British freighter. The Germans had every right to stop it. But as they were allowing the British to get into lifeboats and get out back on the ocean before the German U-boat would sink the freighter, up in the distance, they see another ship, a freighter with an American flag. And that ship signaled that they wanted to help pick up the crew that was now in the lifeboats in the North Atlantic. So the U-27 obligingly stood by while the American freighter approached to pick up the crew members in the lifeboats. But as the ship approached, all of a sudden the American flag came down and a British naval ensign went up, and it turned out to be a Q ship. And a Q ship was purposely built by the Royal Navy to look like a freighter when it was really an armed naval vessel. The Q ship, named Q out of Queenstown in Southern Ireland, which is where they were based, the Q ship opened fire now by surprise on the U-27, which immediately sank. 15 German naval personnel escaped the burning submarine, began swimming in the North Atlantic. Members of the Royal Marine Corps saw them and killed them in cold blood as they were swimming in the North Atlantic. All of this witnessed by Americans who happened to be in the lifeboats who've been serving on the Nicotian, the British freighter. And incidents like that, of course, would tend to discourage British captains and British leaders from even trying to obey the cruiser rules, which is why by the beginning of 1915, they had decided that all of the British Isles should be a war zone and that the submarine fleet reserved the right to shoot on sight. In fact, they usually tried to obey the cruiser rules. They usually did not sink neutral ships, but at least they identified the waters around the British Isles to be a war zone. Neither side seemed able or willing to obey the spirit or the letter of those cruiser rules. And the more that happened, the more Americans were going to die on the high seas. It should also be remembered, and this is important, that U-boat captains really did not, many of them, like obeying the cruiser rules, and the German public was behind them in this because of something that was beginning to be very important by the beginning of 1915, and that is that the Germans were beginning to go hungry because of the British naval blockade. The average German, most of this imported food, the average German in 1914 had about 4,000 calories a day in the German's diet. That was down to 1,700 by the middle of 1915. That's a dramatic drop in caloric intake because of the Royal Navy blockade. As of 1917, Germans were living on a diet of potatoes and bread, and the only country in any position to export food to them was Sweden, and they had precious little of it of themselves. There was almost no fodder for livestock. What cattle were not slaughtered were too thin to provide any meat at all anyway by 1917. 700,000 Germans starved to death on the home front in World War I. Why, Germans asked, should U-boats allow American trade on British ships to get to Great Britain with all that lovely American corn and American wheat and all the production of American factories? Why should U-boats allow any of that to get through when the German people were starving at home because of a German naval blockade that President Wilson showed precious little inclination to condemn? It seemed unfair to the German people. It seemed unfair to U-boat captains. The recipe was set for a willingness to disobey the cruiser rules if, in fact, an opportunity to do so came about that might help the Germans win the war. We'll see when that moment might have happened. Given this ruinous blockade, in other words, why should the submarine fleet of the German Empire not sink any ship they saw? Now, that question was certainly in the mind of Kapitänleutnant Walter Schweiger, who, on the afternoon, famously, of May 7th, 1915, saw before him the tantalizing sight of the Cunard liner Lusitania. A British-flagged vessel, subject to service in the Royal Navy, going much less than the 24 knots that it could go. Your average submarine on the surface could go 15 knots. Lusitania was doing slower than that, I think, on the afternoon of what was about to happen. This seemed like an opportunity too good to miss for Schweiger. The captain of the Lusitania, Captain Turner, was not zigzagging. If you zigzag, that was a really good way to elude the U-boats. They liked it when you were just going like that. He wasn't zigzagging, and he was simply following the coast on the way to make landfall in Liverpool. Believing in broad daylight that he couldn't miss, Schweiger opened fire. Torpedo goes into Lusitania, and we all know what happened next. The ship was carrying 2,000 people. 1,198 died in the North Atlantic, 128 Americans among them. Many of them didn't need to die. If only the lifeboats had been in decent condition, if only there had been lifeboat drills, if only the Royal Navy had been escorting Lusitania, as Captain Turner seems to have thought the Royal Navy would, maybe this wouldn't have happened, but it did happen. And now, with a great deal of tumultuous disapproval in the United States over what the Germans had done, President Wilson had a choice to make. Now, was he going to make this perhaps a cause of war? Was he going to press this issue? Or was he going to simply let it go? Now, what he did was, of course, as you would expect any president to do, was complain. And he insisted that the Germans not sink passenger vessels like the Lusitania, and he insisted that German U-boat captains obey to the letter the cruiser rules. If you're going to take a merchant ship, surface, search it, let the crew get on lifeboats, and only sink it afterwards. Don't sink any ships on sight, neutral or otherwise, British flagged or otherwise. That was the president's demand, and it took months of some negotiation, but finally, genial Count Bernsdorf, the German ambassador in Washington, was able to persuade equally genial Chancellor Bethmann Hollweg, the leader of the German government, to give Wilson everything he wanted. And so by 1916, we have the famous Sussex Pledge. And by the Sussex Pledge, the German government solemnly committed not to sink passenger ships like the Lusitania, and not to sink any merchant ships of any sort, British or otherwise, unless the cruiser rules were obeyed. U-boat surfaces, searches, if there's contraband, maybe sink the ship, but let the crew get on lifeboats, and maybe tow them, if you can, to a position of safety. The Germans backed down. Wilson had won this particular confrontation, and by the end of 1916, there seemed to be less chance than ever that the Americans would ever have any need to enter this war. So the question becomes more burning than ever. Why did we do so less than a year after the Sussex Pledge? Why did we do so in the spring of 1917? So I think the answer has to do with a problem in two people. Now, the problem gets back to our friend, the president. Not that he was a problem, although kind of he was, like we all are. But the problem was this. Remember what he really wanted. What he wanted was to mediate a grand peace, a peace without victory between Germans on the one hand and the British and the French on the other, on the assumption that they would both finally recognize neither could win the war alone. And he would go down in history as the greatest peacemaker of all time. Unfortunately, the more people died, the more the propaganda took fire, the more the populations detested each other with a kind of detestation difficult to imagine today. The more that happened, the more unlikely it was that anybody was going to agree to a mediated peace. The fight, David Lloyd George said, Prime Minister of Great Britain, must be to the finish, a knockout. Any mediated peace would involve the Germans giving up Alsace-Lorraine, withdrawing from Belgium, and the German military command, at least, was never going to agree to that. Attitudes had hardened, hatreds had deepened. How could you compromise under those circumstances when both populations were suffering and both absolutely hated the other? They would never, by the end of 1916, after Verdun, after the Somme, after unimaginable sufferings, agree to a compromise. At least it was unforeseeable that they ever would. And President Wilson solemnly began to recognize that. Great wars had been settled by peace negotiations, mediation, 1648, 1713, 1815. But this was 1916. Never had entire populations been so carefully taught to hate each other as then. Wilson began to see that peace without victory was a chimera. It wasn't going to happen. The only way this war was going to end is if one side or the other won. And Wilson was smart enough to know if one side or the other won, that meant they would be in a position to dominate Europe. They would dictate the kind of peace they wanted. The only way to get any element of an American Wilsonian peace, freedom of the seas, free trade, disarmament, the rights of small nations, a League of Nations, all those idealistic goals, they could only be achieved, if at all, if the United States was at the peace table somewhere on behalf of the winning side. Maybe they could wear down the edges of a dictated, very harsh peace, but they would have to enter the war to do so. And President Wilson slowly began to realize in the early months of 1917 that if he wanted to influence the peace at all, it had to be on behalf of the warring side that would win. And it being unthinkable to him that he could ever enter the war on the German side, of course, the only alternative was the British side. In the beginning of 1917, he was beginning to see that. So the problem was that would lead to our intervention, the Wilsonian understanding that a mediated peace was probably beyond contemplation. Things had gotten too bad and savage and horrible. And that leads me to the two people. So there's one problem, and that's Wilson's recognition of what a mediated peace had begun to be, which is impossible. And then two people would lead us finally to the decision, ultimately, to enter the war, because these people would bring American opinion finally to the idea that maybe that's what was called for. So person number one is the person you see on the right. You all know the person on the left, that's the Kaiser, but the person on the right was the man who would make a big, big mistake at the beginning of 1917. And to understand that mistake, let's get back to the situation facing Germany at the beginning of 1917. Allies were in terrible shape. Russians were about to have a revolution, of course, but at least the Allies, Britain and France, were eating. The Germans were not. The Germans were starving in the winter of 1916, 1917. The British blockade was brutally effective, and the German harvest of 1916 was a catastrophic disaster, awful, partly because of shortages of fertilizer and labor with all those men on the Western and Eastern fronts. The average German had a weekly food allowance of 1 egg, 3 pounds of potatoes, and a horrible thing called war bread, which was really just potato flour. If you were lucky, you had some rabbits. And that would be the only meat you had for many people, if you were lucky. Hardly any pigs. The German government had ordered 9 million pigs slaughtered at the beginning of 1915. They thought they would save money on fodder, food for the pigs that way. In fact, they saved no grain, no potatoes from doing that. All they did was deprive the people of what could have been a good source of pork. By the way, the mass slaughter of the pigs is known as the Schweinmord in German history, and there's actually a punk band called Schweinmord, but I don't recommend them. I just happened to look them up. For many others, if they might have had rabbit meat, but for many, the real salvation was the great hero of the winter of 1917, and that's the turnip. And for many Germans, that was the difference between life and death. The rutabaga or the turnip, things that they usually wouldn't eat, but they dug them from the ground and they survived on that. It has always been known in German history as the turnip winter of 1916, 1917. By January, food riots were becoming very common in German cities. People were demanding anything they could get. And what little police force were remaining in the German cities, who were actually in uniform on the Western Front, were having their hands full to contain those riots. What little food there was, of course, there was no surplus, but much of it, of course, had to go to the men in uniform, leaving people behind to slowly wither and starve. And the German High Command believed something has to be done quickly. We've got to win the war quickly. We can't go on like this. So at the beginning of January 1917, there was a grand meeting of the High Command. Ludendorff, Hindenburg, the Kaiser was there, although he didn't amount to much by 1917. And the turnips weren't there. This guy was there. They didn't eat turnips. That's the commander of the German Navy who had replaced Tirpitz in the middle of World War I. That's Count Holzendorf. And Count Holzendorf believed with all his might that if only the U-boats were unleashed, if only they could sink any ship they saw on sight approaching the British Isles, the British would be quickly starved out of the war. And everybody in the German High Command always assumed, and they'd assumed this since 1914, that if the Germans could knock the British out of the war, the French would follow quickly. All they had to do was knock the British out. And if only the U-boats were unleashed, if only they could ignore all the cruiser rules and sink anything on the way to the British Isles, even without warning, the British must slowly starve. They could never produce anything like the food for themselves that they would need on their own. All that American wheat would go to the bottom of the Atlantic, and the Germans would win the war in a matter of months. So Holzendorf now promised the German High Command that he could sink with his U-boats so many ships on the way to Britain with the needed food and materiel that within 6 months, the British would have to make peace. Holzendorf had no business at all saying anything like that. As a horrified Chancellor Bethmann Hollweg pointed out, if the Germans were to begin to sink anything approaching the British Isles, that would not only mean Americans or British ships would die, it would also mean American ships would be sunk. The 8% of our commerce actually carried on our ships. That would violate the Sussex Pledge. That might bring the United States into the war. Unrestricted submarine warfare, anything near the British Isles, would be something Wilson would have to respond to. He'd have no alternative. But this objection meant nothing to Holzendorf, who calmly assured the Kaiser, we don't have to worry about the Americans entering the war. Even if they do so, I will make sure not a single transport reaches Europe. German U-boats would sink everything on the North Atlantic. This was nothing short of ruinous madness. Holzendorf had dramatically, unforgivably overestimated the capacity of his U-boat fleet. The Germans could have done it if they had 1,000 U-boats in the North Atlantic. The Germans didn't have 1,000 U-boats on the North Atlantic. The Germans had 100 U-boats in the North Atlantic, and they couldn't all be out at once. He had no business making a statement like that. And more important, neither the Kaiser nor Hindenburg nor Ludendorff had any business believing it once it was made. But Hindenburg and Ludendorff, for their own reasons, backed the submarine commander, backed Holzendorf. They didn't think an offensive on the Western Front would succeed in 1917, but they thought this might. And therefore, the Germans made their dread decision, the secret decision in January of 1917, to resume unrestricted submarine warfare as of February 1st and sink anything on sight on the way to the British Isles, abandoning all pretense of observing the cruiser rules, which, after all, they had been doing, observing the cruiser rules ever since the Sussex Pledge, with some care. And they do it. On February 1st, German U-boats began sinking ships on sight. And they sank hundreds of thousands of tons of produce in commerce. They would sink 25% of all ships bound to Great Britain. They would put the British in a position where they only had 6 weeks' worth of wheat at one point. And they would lose the war. Not for the last time did military men completely show an incapacity to understand diplomacy. Because what that would do ultimately would be to help drive the United States into the war. And that's why Bettman Holvig, once the decision was made, muttered to himself, Germany is lost. Germany is lost. An American entry into the war would mean German defeat. And the risk of an American entry was too great to do anything like this. And that leads me now to problem number 2. Problem man number 2 especially, and that's this guy here, Alfred von Zimmermann. So here's how the calculation is going. Wilson finally, by the beginning of 1917, was beginning to think that a mediated peace would be very difficult, if not impossible. He was going in that direction. Maybe intervention on the Allied side was the only way for America to influence the world after the war. But you still had to have American opinion support you. And one thing that this unrestricted submarine warfare was going to do was influence that vital American public opinion. And the second thing that would do it happened because of the first thing. And it happened because of Alfred Zimmermann. There he is. Worst thing that ever happened to the Germans in World War I was that Alfred Zimmermann decided to go home to Germany from a trip to China by way of San Francisco. And this was years before the war. But he got on a nice train in San Francisco, took a nice train trip across the country, spent 2 weeks on the train, Union Pacific. And because he was in the country for 2 weeks, he decided he understood everything about the United States. Zimmermann did not really believe that the United States would enter World War I, even though unrestricted submarine warfare would take effect, and they still hadn't announced it, as of February 1st. But he did want to, as German foreign minister, try to take care of the eventuality of that war the best he could, just in case it should happen. So what he did was he decided to get in touch with the Mexicans, and famously, he decided to make a deal with the Mexicans, or propose a deal with the Mexicans, whereby if the United States were to enter the war, World War I, there'd be a German alliance with Mexico, and what would the Mexicans get in case of a German victory? Anybody remember? Texas, Arizona, and New Mexico. Not California. I'm not going to give away California, but the idea would be that Germany would use its influence and its power in the event of a German victory, in the event the U.S. did enter the war, to make sure that the Mexicans could regain the territory they lost in 1848, at least some of it, New Mexico, Arizona, and Texas. So I've got the pledge that he made. This is the telegram that he was about to send to the German embassy in Washington, who had transmitted to the German embassy in Mexico City. And what he said was, we will make peace together. Generous financial support will come from Germany, and an understanding on our part that Mexico is to reconquer the lost territory in Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona. But that wasn't even the worst part of it. The worst part of it was that not only would Germany get those territories back for Mexico, Mexico and Germany would also cooperate to ensure the Japanese would come in on the war on the German side and the Mexican side and maybe show up themselves in California. So what he was doing here was not only trying to get Mexico into the war against us, if in fact we did declare war, but also Japan. This was a decision of awe-inspiring stupidity. That's the Zimmermann telegram in code, the way it actually looked when it was put on the Western Union telegram. Now here's why there's almost no way to grasp the oceanic, almost cosmic level of stupidity of that idea. First of all, Mexico was never even remotely thinking that they could ever have Texas, Arizona, and New Mexico back. Their own generals had told President Carranza when Zimmermann's telegram arrived that this is never going to happen. Even if we were to invade across the Rio Grande, we can never hold this place. It's outrageous. It's never going to happen. So Mexicans weren't interested in this from the least bit. But what about the Japanese, who are now being promised that a Japanese-Mexican-American alliance could actually ensue with great advantage in the Pacific to the Japanese? The Japanese weren't interested in that at all. Why would they be? They were doing fine in World War I, that is. They were taking all sorts of German territories in the Pacific that eventually Americans would get to know about 30 years later. Among them was Saipan, which was a German colony, became Japanese in World War I because they had entered the war on the British side, and they were happy on the British side. Why would they switch sides now? Zimmermann had no reason to think they would. But he made that pledge in the telegram. So here's what he did. He put it in the telegram, and the code people put it in the code. There's the German code right there. And because the British, on the first day of the war, had cut the direct cables leading across the Atlantic from Germany to the New World, what they had to do was go to the American embassy in Berlin. We weren't at war with them yet, but so the Germans took it to the American embassy, said, well, don't read, we can't read it anyway because it's in code. And they said, can you just transmit this to Denmark? So we transmitted to Denmark. From Denmark, it went to London because all that traffic had to go through London. And the idea was if it's originating in the American embassy in Berlin, it's technically an American cable, they're not going to read it. Well, no, they did read it. And unknown to the Germans, the British had broken the German code. They broke the German code in 1914. So they could read anything the Germans sent to the New World along this traffic. So Denmark, London, Cornwall, right by Penzance, the famous cable station in Cornwall, and from there to the American embassy. But on the way, the British decided to take a peek at this little thing. And they found at 3 p.m. on January 16th that, in fact, what they had was the greatest intelligence coup of the early 20th century. A man who happened to come across it and was the first one to actually put this in English and translate it, rushed into the office of his superior and excitedly yelled, "Do you want to bring America in the war?" And the superior said, "Yes, my boy, I think I would." Well, this is it. Here's something that if the Americans knew, of course, they'd be enraged, infuriated at this. All we had to do as the British was to make sure the Americans knew. But you see what the problem with that is? By now, it's the third week in January. Now the Germans know unrestricted submarine warfare is coming in February. So they know that now, although we didn't know that yet. But were they going to tell us about Zimmerman's offer? Well, they couldn't, because if they told us right away and we made it public, the Germans would know that the British had broken the code. And the Germans had no idea that the British had broken the code. So what the British had to do was adopt a little bit of chicanery. They're going to sit on it for a while. They're going to see what happens when the German U-boats start sinking ships on sight. Let a little bit of time goes by. If we still don't enter the war by late February, then what the British will do will be to engage in some deception, and we'll see what they did. They want to tell us without letting the Germans know that the German code had been broken. The German announcement of unrestricted submarine warfare came at the end of January. On February 1st, it was official. The Germans would now sink anything on the way to the British Isles. On February 3rd, an American ship, the Housatonic, was approaching Great Britain. Very, very ironically, the very first modern ship sunk by a submarine was the Housatonic, sunk by the Confederates in Charleston Harbor in 1864. Now we have another Housatonic on the North Atlantic, and also, maybe ironically, it was a German ship. It was made in Germany, was in German commercial traffic, but we interned it, we took it in 1914 in New York, and now it was the Housatonic. So here's the Housatonic nearing the British Isles with a shipment of grain. It was stopped by the U-53, commanded by Lieutenant Rose. Rose stopped the ship. He's going to obey the cruiser rules. He's not going to sink it on sight. He's going to obey the cruiser rules. He stopped the ship, surfaced, searched the ship for contraband, found a bunch of wheat, and this is what he said in perfect English to the captain of the Housatonic. "You are carrying foodstuffs to an enemy of my country, and though I am sorry, it is my duty to sink you." He let the crew get out on lifeboats. All he stole from the ship was a bunch of soap, because to make soap in Germany, they needed glycerin, and glycerin was used for the war effort, so the Germans were delighted to have all this soap. So they stole the soap from the Housatonic, sunk the rest of the ship. Ship goes down to the North Atlantic. Rose was such a gentleman, he actually, despite the danger to a surfaced U-boat, actually began towing the lifeboats closer to the British coast. And he radioed the British Navy, "Look, I've got some survivors from the Housatonic. Maybe you can come pick them up." Word of the sinking of the Housatonic reached America, but that's not a cause of war. That's no big deal. And the British were frustrated now. They unrestricted submarine warfare, but the Germans really aren't acting on it. And then a couple weeks later, in the Mediterranean, a bunch of Maine people, fellow New Englanders, were on the Lyman Law, a schooner approaching Sardinia with a load of American goods. It happened to be little wooden strips that you use in lemon casks. A German submarine sees the Lyman Law in the Mediterranean, approaching Sardinia, surfaces, stops the Lyman Law, searches for contraband, finds little bits of wood for lemon casks, decides that's contraband, it's lumber. Now they're going to sink the Lyman Law, but they let the crew get in lifeboats again. And the man who sunk the Lyman Law happened to be pretty famous. He was a guy named Lieutenant Arnaud de la Pierre, who happened to be the biggest submarine ace in history. He sank 450,000 tons of cargo himself. He sank over 143 ships himself. Number 2 is Dan O'Kane of the U.S. Navy in World War II. He's number 1. And he was a very courteous fellow. He said, you guys, I'll give you time, get in the lifeboats, we're going to be fine. And then he sank the ship. That's not a big deal. That's no cause of war. And Wilson was beginning to think by the end of February, maybe there's no reason to declare war. The Germans say they'll sink anything, but they're not. They're not doing it. So now what do you do if you're the British? Now you take the Zimmerman telegram. And they've concocted a story whereby one of their agents in Mexico City just happened to steal a translated copy of it so they could pretend they hadn't really broken the code and read it that way. And they managed to get a translated copy of it to the pro-British ambassador in London, Walter Page, who had been advocating for war since 1914. And Page transmitted the telegram to Lansing, our Secretary of State, who had also been advocating for war for a long time. And he was delighted to see this. And he brought it to Wilson, who was infuriated by this. How dare they? What treachery? And Wilson caused it to be published. Newspapers around the country now published the Zimmerman telegram, and there was vast outrage. And now you began to see, little by little, a critical mass of the American people already not happy about the German announcement of February 1st, now really unhappy about this. Now, what do you do if you're Zimmerman? Why not just say, I never did it. They made it up. There are enemies. Of course they make it up. It's fake news. Why not just say that? And anyway, what's so bad about what Zimmerman had done? The British and the French, to get Italy to enter the war in 1915, had promised half of what used to be Yugoslavia to the Italians. All the Germans were doing was the same thing. They're promising the American Southwest. What's the big deal? That's just what warring powers do. Zimmerman could have pretended it didn't happen. That might have been the best thing. He could have lied, but he wasn't that kind of guy. He actually stood up in the Reichstag and he said, yeah, we did it. We admit it. It was us, because he didn't think it was that bad. But it was that bad from the American point of view, not just because we're afraid of the Mexicans, but it was mostly the Japanese invasion. That is what got the American public. How dare they? How dare the Germans even think about something like that? So by the beginning of March, now we see popular opinion moving, and all that needs to happen now is for the president to make the final decision. And here he is again, back to our friend from Augusta in Columbia, in Stanton, Woodrow Wilson. He still didn't think, with the German U-boat commanders obeying the cruiser rules, that he really had a good reason yet to declare war. But that would stop in the 3rd week of March, when, for the first time, a German U-boat commander purposely sank an American flag ship without warning. And that was the Vigilancia, sunk on March 17th, I think. And very shortly after that, 2 more ships were sunk. A total, eventually, by the end of March, of about 7 ships will be sunk, most of them obeying the cruiser rules, but I think 3 without. 3 were just shot on sight and sunk. Most of the crew survived. I think only 9 died in the ships. But that was clearly a violation of the cruiser rules. And President Wilson, as the defender of neutral rights, the defender of international law and order, took that as a dread affront. And what he now realized was that if the Germans were going to act on their pledge to sink ships on the way to the British Isles, that meant that the Americans could be nothing other than an ally of the British. That meant no mediated peace. Any little chance of that was gone completely now. The only chance to influence the world was to enter the war. And now that the Germans are doing this, actually acting on their threat, it was now time to act on those facts. So he made the decision to enter the war, we think, around March 21st or 22nd. He called his cabinet together. He told them about it. They all agreed. It was unanimous that we have to enter the war now. The Germans made the Sussex Pledge. Now they're violating it. They're going back on it. The Zimmerman telegram outraged many Americans. So with a critical mass, for the first time, now in support of war, and Wilson figuring there's no hope of a mediated peace anyway, he made the decision to ask for war, which he finally did on April 2nd, in the greatest speech of his life. The speech in front of a joint House of Congress, dramatically asking for a declaration of war. And I'll just read the very last bit of his war message, which was followed by hooting and hollering and hats thrown, if you had them, in the chamber of the House of Representatives. And what Wilson said was this: it's a distressing and oppressive duty, gentlemen of Congress, which I have performed in thus addressing you. It is a fearful thing to lead this great peaceful people into war, into the most terrible and disastrous of all wars. civilization itself seeming to be in the balance. But the right is more precious than peace, and we shall fight for the things which we have always carried nearest our hearts: democracy, the right of those who submit to authority to have a voice in their own governments, for the rights and liberties of small nations, for a universal dominion of right, by such a concert of free peoples as shall bring peace and safety to all nations and make the world itself at last free. So the Wilsonian dreams, which at first had been on behalf of a mediated peace, now could only be served on the behalf of a victorious peace, with all the disasters and bloodshed that would bring in its train. And that, I think, is why we finally decided to enter the war. So I think we have time for questions, if you'd like. So I don't know if anybody has a microphone, but if any of you would like to share a comment or a question, please be my guest. And if you can do it without a microphone, maybe we don't need one.
So we have 2 microphones.
Oh, and also you can get up and you can get cookies, I guess, because we have cookies. And some delicious apple. Oh, thank you. Thanks very much. Thank you. Yes. Very good to see you all, by the way. Yes?
When was the Lusitania signed?
May of 1915. So we let months go by negotiating with the Germans, and they delivered the Sussex Pledge in the early, it took a while, but it was 1916 when they did. And in the meantime, they weren't sinking our ships. Yeah. Anybody? Oh, yeah, if we have a question in the front row, maybe. Oh, that's a really good question. What about convoys? That was the solution to the merchant vessel problem, where U-boats could sink merchant vessels if they wanted to. The convoy system did it. The Royal Navy didn't much like the idea of convoys, but they began to adopt them more and more by 1916. And when we entered the war, now they had all these American destroyers to help. Americans proved to be pretty good at the convoy system, and that eventually, by the end of 1917, would really cause Allied tonnage sunk in the North Atlantic to sink. The Germans did sink a lot of ships. Holzendorf said, if we can sink if we can sink 500,000 tons of cargo per month, we'll drive the British out of the war. They came close, but not nearly what it would have been had it not been for the convoys. So there were convoys in World War I. They were adopted late, but they worked when they were adopted. Yes, go ahead.
Folks, if we could just wait for the mic when you ask a question, just so that people who are using the hearing device can also hear the questions through the mic. Thank you.
So in March or so, when Wilson was changing his mind and deciding to enter, were the Americans aware of the tottering nature of the Russian government and the likelihood that they would fall?
Yeah, they were aware of that because it had just happened. It had just happened at exactly the same time, and I didn't mention that, but that was something that Wilson thought was important, because now we could actually paint this war as a struggle for democracy and not a struggle, as the Germans saw, to maintain Russian aristocracy. That was actually a big deal, so Americans did know that. Yes?
Yeah.
Oh, go ahead.
When did the United States start to build up their armed forces? I presume it was before the actual declaration.
Wilson had embarked upon what he called a preparedness campaign as early as 1916. So it wasn't controversial, because Charles Evan Hughes, who Wilson ran against, also believed in preparedness. So there was a very small-scale buildup of the U.S. Army that had already begun. It took mostly the form of building up the National Guard rather than the regular army, but it did take place. But it took place on nothing like the scale that the United States began to build up its own armed forces just before Pearl Harbor. There was only a slight buildup. And they painted it as preparedness, so that in case we get invaded, we'll be ready. They did not paint it as building up any kind of force that could ever be taken across the Atlantic. That would have been a much more radical endeavor. So there was only a small-scale buildup. And we didn't have any tanks in 1917, very few warplanes to speak of. Almost everything we were going to need was going to have to be provided by the French and the British once we got there. Okay, back here.
Yeah. So a lot of the story you told is about Wilson and that perspective. Of course, there was a strong American isolationist movement.
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about what happened to them and why they didn't have any countervailing power as 1917 unfolded?
Well, the power that they had was fairly appreciable through most of the war, especially in the Midwest. The isolationist tendency had a lot to do with the Hearst newspapers that certainly fed that isolationist tendency and struggled mightily to preserve American neutrality. It never ceased being pretty strong in much of the Midwest, but the difficulty was that as of 1917 at least, and in the era we're talking about, much of American opinion and much of American political muscle was on either coast. And what you had then was an isolationist tendency that when push came to shove, couldn't really keep America out of the war. But that didn't mean it went away. The vote in the Senate was pretty lopsided. I think it was 82-6. But the vote in the House, there were 50 votes against war, most of them from the Midwest. Those who were opposed to the war were often progressives who wouldn't be isolationists in 1941, but they passed that way in 1917. Many of them thought that the whole point of the war was to make money for American banks and to make sure that American banks like the Morgan Bank would be paid back by the British in the event the British won the war. I don't think that was the reason Wilson cared about entering the war. I don't think he cared about the Morgan Bank that much. I think he did care about these other principles. But in terms of isolationism, the other thing that was working against that tendency, especially in the Midwest, was that many people in the Midwest were Germans, and they had absolutely no reason or no will to be seen as unpatriotic by talking too much about isolationism. So even if they believed it, they didn't much act on it in terms of voting decisions and agitation. They often kept quiet. So I think that is probably why that Midwest tendency towards isolation couldn't make itself as powerful as otherwise would have. But that's a good question. I don't think I have a complete answer for it. But this critical mass of public opinion had reached the point where maybe it was just overcome at the last. Yes, go ahead. Oh, well, it was not
Was
at
it
all
all volunteer, or was there a draft? I mean, did
It was
they
a draft.
Yeah,
It was a draft right away in World War I. And it was the second draft in our history after the Civil War conscription. But almost everybody understood you couldn't fight a war like this with a volunteer army. The British understood that, although they hated to admit it. The French and the Germans knew it from the very beginning. So we followed suit. And we had a draft, I think, beginning in April. I think it happened right away, as soon as we declared war. Go ahead, yes.
If we're selling grain to the British,
Yes.
we're not totally neutral.
Oh, no.
We were teaching their pilots to fly in Fort Worth.
Mm-hmm.
So again, we sort of
Well,
already have
that's the other reason why a mediated peace probably wasn't going to happen. The Germans didn't think we were completely neutral. They knew we were making money on British trade. They knew how much the British depended upon our trade. The German High Command very much hated the American government by 1917. So even if they would ever submit to some sort of a mediated peace conference, which was pretty much out of the question anyway, but even if they did, they were not going to let Wilson be in charge of it. They didn't trust him at all, because of what looked to them like a de facto American belligerency on the British side, even before April 1917. That's right. Well, that's a good point. I don't think so. Teaching pilots before 1917? Not that I'm aware of. But they were during the war. Mm-hmm. I think they were at some point during the war, but I don't know about before that. Yeah. I don't know about before 1914. Okay, go ahead.
You said that the American ambassador in London and some of the cabinet members were eager to get into the war in 1914. Do you know what their motivations were?
Well, they were special. Page was an Anglophile who believed that German militarism was a threat to all civilization. Page thought the British were the unalloyed good guys, the Germans were the unalloyed bad guys. He'd lived in London a lot. He loved the British. So from the very beginning, from the summer of 1914, he hoped that we would enter the war on the British side. Lansing came along later because who remembers who was our Secretary of State in 1914? Very good, William Jennings Bryan. William Jennings Bryan worked as hard as he could to keep us out of the war. He believed in genuine neutrality. But he resigned after the Lusitania because he thought we were too tough on the Germans because of that. And that brought in Robert Lansing. So as of 1915, we have another confirmed Anglophile who very much believed that the only way the Germans could be defeated was if the Americans entered the war. He wanted the Germans defeated. So now we got Lansing and Page. And number three, we got Wilson's best friend, the famous Texas Railroad man, Edward House. Edward House knew exactly what you needed to do to be friends with Woodrow Wilson, which is agree with everything he says. And that's what he did. He was really, really good at that. And Edward House was his leading advisor. Edward House also wanted for the United States to enter the war. House, Lansing, Page, they're all a good little conspiracy going to push Wilson towards an understanding that he no longer had a choice. Wilson was always his own man. He couldn't be pushed too far. But it didn't help the cause of neutrality that you had three really influential people, Page and Lansing and House, all together working for intervention. On the other side, though, they had my friend Joseph Daniels of North Carolina and the Secretary of War, Newton Baker. And Daniels, I love, he was kind of a pacifist. It's good to have your Secretary of the Navy as a pacifist. That's what he was, Secretary of the Navy. So Daniels and Baker were on the other side. They're trying to lead Wilson away from intervention. But it was really important when the Vigilancia was sunk by the end of March. And I think Daniels, who of course was the Navy guy, Secretary of the Navy, and also Newton Baker, even they came to think that if that's what the Germans were actually going to do, if they're actually going to sink our ships on site, then probably we do have no choice. That's the only thing that brought them around. Before that, they were on behalf of neutrality. There's always been a story, and some of you are veterans, so you might know that this is wrong. But the story always was that the reason we call Coffee Joe is after Joseph Daniels, because there's going to be no alcohol in the fleet, but he can drink coffee. And he was a teetotaler, so they would call Coffee Joe, Cup of Joe. And in my opinion, there's no truth at all to that. But that's always been a story. And also, a fun fact, Newton Baker was the Secretary of War. The county seat of Baker, the county seat of Baker County, Georgia is Newton, which is the way I always remember it. Why would I care about Baker County, Georgia? Well, that's a whole other story. No, yes, go ahead, yes.
I have a two-part question.
Oh, no. Go ahead.
First part was you talked about the potential for starvation in Germany and in Britain. What about France? Did the French public, were they mostly self-sufficient because it was a more agricultural country?
They were much more self-sufficient.
Okay.
They were much more self-sufficient, and they could depend upon our grain too. So not all the grain went to Britain. Some of it went to the French. The prices for grain really went up during the war for everybody. Of course, you always got to have inflation during the war. Didn't go up nearly as high as it would have without American grain, though. So yeah, they could feed them, if not feed themselves, at least they had our imports too.
Okay, the second part was, what was the American public's attitude towards France in the build-up to the war?
The American public actually knew very, very little about France. As far as political consequences go, the American public very much thought that France was the innocent victim, along with Belgium. All the information about the war that came to the United States pretty much came via Britain and France. So the story about the war was the story they wanted us to know. And the reason was, of course, the German cable had been broken. The Germans can't communicate directly with us, so it was the British and the French. And of course, there were many stories of French heroism in the trenches and stories of heroic French civilians. Americans very much were influenced by those stories. So there's no doubt about it that there was great sympathy with the French, less so with the British, but especially with the French. And when we got over here, when Americans got over to France, it was the same thing. The typical American doughboy kind of liked the French, not much use for the British. We thought that the British believed they knew more about war than we thought they did. Actually, they did know more about war than we did. But they certainly resented the British tendency to try to teach us what we thought they shouldn't be teaching us. Got along much better with the French, especially because we were billeted, American doughboys, remember, with French civilians for much of the winter of 1918. And among other things, we influenced French, we introduced French children to chewing gum. And French children soon learned what Santa Claus was. We dressed up like Santa Claus for Christmas of 1917. So there's a lot of goodwill between Americans and French, not so much between Americans and the Tommies, though.
We have a question back here.
Oh.
Hi, excuse me. Why did Wilson choose to ignore the German sabotage going on based in the greater New York area, especially the Toms River?
Toms River, right.
And also, they were making cigar bombs and planting them on American ships and blowing them up, and that was before the unrestricted...
Yes, excellent question. So the question is, why would Wilson not make such a big deal out of the proven fact that there were German saboteurs in America trying to blow up American munitions plants, which everybody knew were producing things to head to the British Isles? And the reason is that he did not want to make such a big deal of that because he had every incentive not to inflame the American public in favor of war. So he downplayed it as much as he could. And not until he was really ready for war, not until he himself had made that decision, what would he talk about that? And eventually there was a huge crackdown on any scent of espionage. But that was not true before 1917. But that's a good question. It was Wilson's political purposes that meant that he didn't want to make a big deal of that. Is there one more? Okay. Oh, maybe. How about maybe two more, and then I guess that'll be all. Because, yeah.
So was World War I just a continuation then of? I mean, World War II just a continuation.
Well, you often hear that idea.
Unfinished business.
And so we got this dictated peace that really was a peace with victory. There was no alternative to that. There was no way the French and the British would put up with anything else. So the argument has long been that World War II, with Hitler coming to power partly because of the Treaty of Versailles and German resentment towards it, might have been a continuation of World War I. Now, I don't usually like to think of it that way. There was every chance that the Treaty of Versailles could have been made to work. The Allies made adjustments in it. Reparations weren't nearly as bad as they were in the original treaty. There was every reason to think that there could have been a long-term peace, especially if we'd worked out the balance of payments and gold standard issue during the 1920s. And if you could have avoided the Great Depression or worked your way out of it with international cooperation at the beginning of the 1930s, which you could have, I don't think there would have been a World War II. I don't think there would have been a Hitler. I think if you call World War II a continuation of World War I, you let statesmen off the hook, and they deserve to be on the hook for what happened. So I don't think, I wouldn't think of it that way, no. And here's our last one, right?
One here, too. I was just going to ask, was the American public aware that the cable had been broken and that everything we were getting was...
Yeah, we knew the cable was broken because the Germans knew that. They broadcasted. They told people, and people knew the cable was broken. But the British never admitted that they broke the German code until, I think, 1939. I think they never wanted to admit it. And there's always been controversy about that because, and this happened in World War II as well, the British would not warn some groups of their military personnel that the Germans were going to do something because they felt if they did, the Germans would figure something was up. So people died because the British wanted to keep that a secret. They felt on balance, it made more sense for them to keep it a secret than it would be to reveal it by maybe alerting people to a military operation that was about to happen. That was especially true in the high seas because the British had some ability to intercept a wireless traffic from the submarines when they were on the surface. They could read some of those messages, but they didn't always let merchant ships know where these U-boats were, and some people went down to the bottom because of that. Yeah.
To what extent was World War I really a continuation of the Franco-Prussian War?
Oh, well, there's another good question. Well, here's what Bismarck said. Now, Bismarck might agree that this is exactly what happened, because at the end of the Franco-Prussian War, the Germans had a decision to make. They'd just been unified. They just created the German Empire in the Hall of Mirrors in the Treaty of Versailles. Now they've got to figure out what the treaty is going to be. And what a lot of the German high command wanted was Alsace-Lorraine. So give us that part of eastern France, and that would be war spoils. Bismarck did not think that was a terribly good idea. He did not want to create a spirit of revenge among the French. But Kaiser Wilhelm I wanted it, the people around him wanted it, so Bismarck acceded to that. But he said, if we take Alsace-Lorraine, there'll be another war in 50 years. And he was off by a decade, but he was right. There was another war. And one of the reasons was the French spirit of revanche, occasioned by those hooded statues of Alsace and Lorraine that you could always see in Paris, along with the other departments which were unhooded, but with Alsace-Lorraine hooded. No Frenchman ever forgot. And every French recruit who was drafted into the military in peacetime was taken to those hills overlooking Lorraine, close to the great fortress of Metz. And the recruits were told, look out. We won't speak of it again, but look out, that's where you're going. That's where we've got to go. They all thought about it. It would be easy to say that the First World War, in that sense, was made likely because of the unresolved issue of 1871, that spirit of revenge. But I still don't think it's true. The war didn't have to happen. People in charge in Austria-Hungary, the people around the Kaiser, made dreadful, unforgivable mistakes in the summer of 1914. It's a series of terrible miscalculations that led to the war. You could have had another 10 years, you could have another 20 years go by without that war. But the decisions they made, again, are decisions that they bear responsibility for before history. So the 11 million who died in the First World War didn't die because there was something inevitable about what happened in 1871. They died because people who didn't know what they were doing showed it. And too often, that's the story. And that was the story in 1914, too. Okay, thank you. Thanks very much.